begin, we must take a moment to recover from Rahul's reading. Eve?
I just want to say that was such a beautiful reading, Rahul, and I want to just give him an incredible applause for that. It was so
good. I'm here for a couple of reasons. First of all, I was promised that Eve would sign my book at the end of it. I don't know why you guys are here. Secondly, because I mean, the opportunity to be on this stage, in this room, which is so beautiful.
It's such a beautiful place. I was saying to her backstage, it's like a gilded vagina we're sitting in. It's gorgeous, just gorgeous.
Opportunity number 3 is to use the word vagina repeatedly in public, which you don't get to do on television. So I'm going to say it a lot. I read the book when it was sent to me, and I read it again last night, and it's important to give the audience context to Rahul's reading as well. This was an apology that you wrote, that you imagined your dead father ought to have given you, but he never did.
Yes, and I think as a child, from a very young age, my father sexually abused me from 5 to 10. And then after, when I finally began to resist, he became very, very violent for the next years of my life, almost murdering me a few times. And I think I always dreamed, when I got older, that my father would somehow wake up and see the wrongness of his deeds and apologize, and have that moment where he would come and out of his kind of narcissistic belligerence and say, and see what he had done, and guess what? That didn't happen. And so 31 years have passed since my father died. And I would say, like, during that period, 25 of those years, I have fought with my life to end violence against all women and girls. And I think what I've seen in our movements, that women are so extraordinary. We've broken the silence, we've told our stories, we've risked humiliation and judgment and all kinds of degradation by coming forward. We've opened hotlines, we've opened shelters, we've created gender programs, and particularly women in India who have just run such powerful movements here. Yet it occurred to me that in all this time, I have never heard a man publicly apologize for battery, harassment, or rape, or incest in all those years. And then I started to think, in 16,000 years of patriarchy, have we ever seen a public recorded apology from a man about one of those things? And I don't mean an I'm sorry I hurt you, or I'm sorry if you feel bad. I'm talking about an in-depth apology. And I realized the fact that there hadn't been any might be pretty central to why we're continuing on in this incredible war between men and women. So I decided I was going to write the apology I had never gotten, to say the words I needed to hear, to climb inside my father and to let my father inside me, and to really write and see what an apology would be, what would the architecture of an apology be, and what could a blueprint for other men might look like having written this.
It's interesting, and I'll go back to the details in the book, but we've seen so much of these apologies in the last 2 years since the Me Too movement started, and a lot of them sound like, if you think I might have done something that may not have been acceptable at the time, given the fact that you were drunk, you seemed like you wanted it, and if somehow you might think this is wrong, then maybe I'm sorry.
Exactly. Or they're framed in, I read a couple where the whole thing is, look what's happened to my life since you spoke out about me. And look how my career has been ruined, look how this has been, but no admission of what has been done, and no feeling for what happened to the woman as a result of those actions.
And I think that, Rahul's reading put it forward very beautifully, and you will all know when you read the book even further, the gaslighting that normally comes with abuse and rape, which is that you were asking for it, or it was some sort of consent, or it happened because of some of the other consequence or some situational reason. But the book actually, you've written out very beautifully how none of these things were excuses, how there was no consent from a 5-year-old. There was no sort of bodily response. This was all in the head of the abuser. And perhaps that's the most, it's the thing we've never heard, where the apology comes with zero sort of justification.
Or condition, exactly. I think one of the things about writing this book, which for me was so both excruciating but also interesting, was I think when women are violated at a young age or any time, but particularly if it's a family member or someone they know well, the perpetrator actually gets inside you. They occupy you. And often you know that person better than you know yourself, particularly if you're afraid of that person, and particularly if that person is abusing you in a serial way constantly. And so you can tell by their footsteps, or you can hear the sound of their voice, you know what's going to happen. And often, as a child, because you love your parent or your uncle or your brother or whoever it is so much, you're actually feeling feelings that they don't feel, because often boys are brought up not to have their feelings. So what I discovered is how well I knew my father, how well he lives inside me, because I had to know him so well in order to protect myself from him. And I think writing this book, there was a huge difference between explanation and justification. I wanted to really look at what happened to my father, what happened in his childhood, what happened in the beginnings of his life in a culture of patriarchy, growing up in a toxic, masculine world. What happened in his family? What were the conditions that created him to become the kind of monster he eventually became?
So, was there at any point, even when you were writing this, did you feel that there may have been a risk of, am I sort of justifying this?
Mm-hmm.
Am I making excuses for him from his childhood for this sort of behavior?
Well, I think there was a real struggle all through it, not to justify, but to understand. But I also feel like we are at a place where we're kind of at each other now. We're at each other. But we're not going underneath the story. We're not going underneath what's happening between us. We're not looking at the impact, for example, of patriarchy and patriarchal families and what it does to boys, for example. And I think if we don't start getting to an understanding of what is happening to boys and what's happening to men and why they are, I just don't believe boys are born monsters. I just don't believe anyone's born a rapist. I don't. I think things happen to people. And I think what I wanted to do in this book is to try to say why. I think survivors are often haunted by why. Haunted. Why would my very good friend drug me and rape me? Why would my father want to destroy his daughter? Why would my boss who hired me put his hand on my leg while I'm giving my biggest, presentation? Why? And I think going into that why is critical to transforming consciousness and finding our way out of the place we're in right now.
Was it also important for you to work your way out, and it might not have been through the book, it sounded like you had managed to do this a little earlier in your life, of a lot of the survivors of abuse and rape struggle with the idea not just of why, but did I do anything to bring this on? Did I attract the abuse? Did I do something? And in India we know that there's this whole idea of ek haath se taali nahi bajti, which is that you can't clap with one hand, so the girl must have done something to bring this on. Was there a portion of that you worked through in your adulthood?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think all children, all life forms, but particularly children because they're still so close to the divine, they haven't been severed from the divine quite yet, are so alive sexually because sexuality is our divine life force, right? And I think when somebody comes and perverts that life force or exploits that life force, you suddenly feel that which is most beautiful about you and pure about you and life-giving about you, it becomes corrupted. right? And you suddenly start feeling guilty for it and bad about it, right? And I think so much of my life, and I know this is true for so many survivors, we walk around thinking, what did I do to provoke this? How did I make this happen? Because also as a child, you need your parents. You don't want your father to be wrong. You don't want your father to be bad. He's the person who's taking care of you and supporting you and who you love. And so very often you take on all that guilt and all that self-hatred because you don't want to hate your father. You don't want to hate your parents. And I think writing this book, I actually got the blame back where it belonged. I got his responsibility was returned to him. And actually he was forced to take it because I got to write it.
You also, through the book, very interestingly, point out the role played by other family members, because you had siblings, your mother was around. While they might not have necessarily witnessed the sexual abuse, they did witness the physical abuse. Was there a healing process there as well?
There was very much a healing process with my mother. You know, I think my mother was of the generation. And I think, sadly, this is still going on in many families all over the world, where my father had all the power, where my mother came from a poor family. My father had money and charm, and he had access to a whole new world. And, you know, it was my mother's way out of that economic situation. And by the time my father started manifesting this really frightening behavior, she had 3 kids. And what was she going to do with 3 children? She was economically dependent on my father. She didn't have a career. She didn't have a job. And when I eventually confronted my mother, which was very difficult, one of the hardest things I've ever done, a few months later, she called me crying, and she said, I realize I sacrificed you. And I was kind of horrified. But she said, where was I going to go with 3 children? And I certainly knew he almost killed you. I knew the violence. I don't know that I consciously knew that he was sexually abusing you, but there was part of me that actually gave you over to him in a way to keep our economic situation. And as horrifying as that was, I don't think that's that unusual. I think there are many situations. I mean, I just remember being in Afghanistan and being with a family once where the daughter had been sold, you know, so that the family could keep living. And this is something that happens everywhere in the world. We're constantly sacrificing our daughters. We're constantly giving them up in order to maintain some kind of economic security. And I think this is something that has to be deeply examined and looked at. But I will say, as my mother got older and we really began to just unpack all this and look at all this between us, she had to then look into her own life and see that she had been sexually abused. And she had gone through her own process where she had not examined that or looked at that. So there was a way we also pass this on and pass this on until it gets broken in a family cycle.
But I think that, you know, and that what you said about sacrificing girls or sacrificing women is very important. And I think that I want to take a moment here in this room for each of us to consider moments where we sacrificed someone. An extended family member we knew was in an abusive marriage, but we didn't want to get involved. A neighbor we could hear was getting battered, but we didn't want to get involved. A colleague we knew was being sexually harassed, but don't want to mess that situation up, don't want to take on that guy. I mean, in bus stops, in nightclubs, in bars, we've seen women in difficult situations. And if we have ever chosen to walk away, we've sacrificed one of our own to abuse, to that abuser, to that bully, or whoever that other person is. And I think this is important because at some point we have to consider our perhaps collective responsibility as society for each other. Because everybody turns around and asks a battered or an abused woman why you don't leave. But the truth is, how many of us are there to catch that person?
I think that's so true. And it was interesting, yesterday I was in Delhi at the Miranda House talking to young students about this, and men were really asking me, and really earnestly, and it was really wonderful to see, what can we do? And I was saying, you know, I travel the world and I never meet all the men I meet are the men who aren't abusing anyone, which is really amazing, seeing that 1 billion women in the world have been raped or battered. Somebody's doing it.
One really busy chap.
Yeah, it's one busy guy. And I said to them, if you're not abusing women, if you're not raping them, if you're not demeaning them, if you're not grabbing them on the streets or on the buses or on the, are you really standing up when you see it being done? Are you speaking to your uncles or your fathers or your brothers or your friends when you hear them degrading women or saying terrible things about them? Are you really breaking the male code? You know, in the book, my father says to me, and when it came out, because sometimes I really don't know who wrote this book, to be honest with you. I think we have a really remarkable...
Don't get your publisher here.
Yes, but I think we have a remarkable relationship with the dead. And the dead are all around us. And I really felt my father's presence through this book very deeply. But he said to me at one point, to be an apologist is to be a traitor to men. And it really hit me. He said, once one man says he's sorry and admits that he knows what he was doing was wrong, the whole story of patriarchy begins to crumble. And I think in a way that's really true. I think the non-apology is holding up, it's one of the columns of patriarchy, right? And I think what we have to do now is invite men to be proud gender traitors and to come out and be the ones who are going to lead the way, just like the early feminists did in breaking out of a paradigm and a mindset that we are completely caught in right now.
Do you think that, and what you say about the apology, given this format of apology, let's assume in an ideal world all apologies sound like this going forward, it would also require for men to acknowledge weakness, vulnerability, guilt, the fact that you allowed temptation to take over. Is that perhaps the root of patriarchy? Because right now the way it works is that you are not a human being, you're a thing. You're property that I own and hence can do with as I please, whether that's a daughter or a wife or a colleague or whoever that is. So to sort of take away the individuality of a woman, is the vulnerability part of that, needed to be part of that apology?
Critical. I think that an apology is a humbling. It's a becoming vulnerable. And if I can just say I kind of learned like the architecture of an apology. I think it is a sacred act. I think it is a sacred act. I mean, we teach our children how to pray. We teach them the constancy of prayer. We teach them the devotion of prayer. We teach our girls how to apologize. I don't know any woman who doesn't say I'm sorry all the time. But we don't teach our boys how to apologize. And an apology is a very specific thing, and it's deep, and it involves self-interrogation, and I would say there are 4 parts to it. The first part is really looking into your childhood and looking into yourself and asking yourself, what were the ingredients that went into making me the kind of man who is capable of rape, of battery, of incest? What was my childhood? Was I sexually abused? Was I told, like my father, I mean, something I really learned in this book. My father was born long after the last child in his family. He was 15 years after. And so he was the accident that became the miracle. He was the divine right of kings. He was the golden boy. He was the one everyone worshipped. And I know, I've been in India coming back and forth enough to know that the boys in India are adored, where the girls are seen as second-class citizens at best. And I think one of the things my father taught me in this book is that adoration is not love. Adoration is a projection of someone's self-idealized image onto you, which you were then mandated to live up to, in being really enforced in some ways to give up your humanity. It means you can't be tender. It means you can't be vulnerable. You can't show weakness. You can't cry. You can't feel, really. You just have to live this kind of incredible idea of yourself that doesn't really include your humanity. So I think the first tenet of an apology is what created you, what made you, what went into it in your culture, in the society. What about patriarchy? I mean, the combination of not being able to feel as a man combined with privilege and power is a really deadly combination. And then the second tenet is, what did I do? What is a detailed accounting of what I did? Because I think the liberation is in the details. You have to say this, you know, it's not I'm sorry if I hurt you, I'm sorry if I abused you, it's I'm sorry that I banged your head against the wall for an hour. I'm sorry that I came into your room at 5 years old and took your underpants off. It's really in the detailed accounting. And part of that detailed accounting is what was my intention? What did I mean to do to you? Did I mean to reduce you? Did I see you as something so powerful and beautiful that I couldn't handle it, so I had to erase it? And the third part is, what did my victim feel when I was doing what I did to her? What was happening in her body? What was happening in her mind? Did I break her heart? Did she feel betrayed? Did she leave her body? What was the long-term impact on her life? Was she then able to form relationships and intimacy, to really open your heart to feel what somebody felt? And then the last part, obviously, is taking responsibility and making amends. All of those steps indicating you become someone who is not capable of doing something like this ever again.
Well, let's not sit in complete silence when we talk about our society and pretend we don't know what the Mera Raja Beta syndrome is in India. We call it the MRB syndrome, where Indian moms believe that their sons have fallen from the sky. And there's actually a saying, so you shouldn't count the number of chapatis that the boys eat. And we have now an endemic problem in India where our children, who are 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5 children in India are underweight and more likely to die of diarrhea because they're feeding the boys more than the girls. And so young girls are giving birth, they're anemic, they're underweight, and they're giving birth to weak babies. And it's all part of this larger system. And in this gilded vagina of a room where we have all of South Mumbai that's gathered, let's also not pretend that this doesn't happen in our homes. And this is not something that's saved for rural India. It happens in every one of our homes. But I want to just step out to the larger picture here. In America, the President of the United States is a man who has been accused not by 1 or 2, but 40 women of abuse. Clear accounts, their names are public, we know who these women are, we know what they say, we have recordings of what he has said, and he is still the leader of that country. Where does that leave the battle and the patriarchy?
Well, that's a very good question. You know, building up to the election, I had such a scary, I battled with our predator-in-chief for probably over the last, I don't know, 20 some odd years of my life. I refuse to use his name, and I haven't since the election because he loves it so much. But I will say that when the tape came out, the Grab the Pussy tape, I really believed in my heart of hearts that would be it. I really did. And when that wasn't it, it began to signal to me that there was something going on that none of us could have ever imagined. And then when one after woman after woman after woman began to come out to talk about the rapes and the harassment and being raped in, you know, changing rooms at department stores, and I feel like there is something happening in the world, not only in America, but throughout the world, whether we look at Duterte or Modi or Bolsonaro or Putin, we are living in this strongman, machismo, fascist era. And misogyny and the absolute desecration of women is completely connected to that paradigm. And I think what's really terrifying is to see how, over the course of this time of the last 3 devastating years in America, this diabolical reign of this narcissistic predator, we have absolutely seen how women now, the level of violence is rising in our country, the level of, I mean, you just have a look at any quarter, whether it's migrant rapes, whether it's rapes of women at jobs, whether it's absolutely escalated because he is in that powerful position. Not to mention the level of racism, xenophobia, and we can just go on the, you know, and destruction of the planet Earth that he is wreaking on us, you know.
Well, the truth is, and it's happening